If it wasn't obvious from my Hitera Newbies ranking video and my endless discussion from my social media posts, I really like the character Whiff. Whiff is cheerful and optimistic. His job is to collect trash and waste, which he enjoys. Either he is blind to the opinions of the other engines, or he does not appear to care what they think of him. He is polite and consistently does his duties at the waste dump well in spite of this. Whiff has demonstrated that despite being treated cruelly by others due to his employment at the rubbish dump, he is a very meek and nice engine who dislikes conflict. He is a little naive since he does not understand why the other engines were making such an effort to avoid him. But since he was aware of the tunnel that connected Misty Island to Sodor, he's revealed to have some knowledge of Sudren history and Misty Island rescue. I think Whiff might very well be one of the most malleable characters within the show. What I mean by that is, with each episode and special that centers him as a prominent role or even a main character, the writers describe him with verified characteristics and strengths and supports the narratives in the story he's featured in. From being characterized someone who was seemingly oblivious to how others perceive him in Emily's Rubbish, to him being an eccentric, fun uncle-like inventor with unconventional ideas in All Engines Go, it's like the writers played spin the wheel and whatever the point landed on would be the personality Whiff was given for a particular episode. He's not necessarily out of character in these eras, but it's a different approach and area of his persona. But in a strange, weird way, I think that's what makes his character so fun. You never know which Whiff you're gonna get. Whiff was truly the character, the beam of light, so to speak, that shone through the more grey eras of Thomas. Whiff's first appearances was all the way back in season 11 with the episode titled Emily's Rubbish. Emily's Rubbish, plot-wise, is a pretty alright episode for season 11. Even if the majority of the episode was that goofy chase sequence between Emily and Whiff, which, albeit, was funny to see. Whiff's character in the Hit era, I think, it was cool with himself as a character, is actually very cute, very friendly. You'd think with him being a stinky garbage engine, he'd be very grumpy or rude because we usually associate garbage with low class, low standard. But Whiff is the most cheery and polite character, and he's very self-aware about it too, which is evident in the way he completely disregards the big engine's comments about him when he passes them with Emily. He knows it's weird. He knows engines will laugh at him. Like, Emily literally says, "I'm sorry I ran away from you because you were smelly, disgusting, gross." And Whiff is like,
"That's all right," whistled Whiff. "I'm just glad you found me."
He's very uncaring, and that's not in a disrespectful manner. He just likes being useful and likes doing what he does. If anything, I'd make the argument he's the one character other than Gordon who takes the most pride in their work, and they don't really care about anything else. In my eyes, instead of Emily, I feel like everyone was laughing at Whiff and Whiff only. Every single tender engine, everyone you had, even the likes of characters such as Molly, Neville, and Murdoch laughing. I think Emily's attitude towards Whiff is morally not right, but you can sort of sympathize and understand it. It shows a different side to her in terms of flaws. Like, yeah, Emily's nice and sensible, but at the same time, she has her own flaws and she can't stoop to those levels. Her being off-put by this character, who's very smelly, it's gonna get anyone a little cringed. Since everyone first seeing Whiff thought he was a little bizarre and weird, but eventually she learns by the end of the episode on her own, because she comes to the realization what Whiff is doing is very important, and she comes to that realization herself and does so in front of Spencer out of all engines. Certainly a departure from what we usually see of her. I wouldn't say it's completely bitchy type of trait since every engine's more or less acting worse than she was to Whiff. It felt redeeming when she realized how useful and dedicated he was, that she saw more value in him, righting her wrongs in a way. If anything, I would say she had a moment of learning here, and was less bitchy as fans may say. She was put down for being with him, and unfairly so. If any other engine were in that situation, they would probably do more harm to Whiff than Emily could. I mean, she doesn't have her own personal feelings about someone. For Thomas and Percy, she gives slack in season 7, but she still likes them and she doesn't have any personal hard feelings towards them either. If you want an example of Emily just being flat out of character, I would say Molly's Special because Emily, in my opinion, wouldn't make fun of Molly for pulling empty coal trucks. Characteristically, it does not fit her. Prior to this episode, Emily has consistently had moments of exhibiting shallow behaviors compared to the likes of James and Gordon in Spick and Span, and even actively compared herself in the latter in As Good as Gordon. Yet, in other episodes, Emily has had no problem of being outspoken in her opinions and convictions, seen in Salty Stormy Tale and Thomas Emily and the Snowplow come to mind. Ultimately, I do understand how Emily's characterization in the episode can come across as a tad bit contradictory given her actions in past episodes. That's the hit era, and even in the show. In general, there are gonna be a lot of characters inconsistencies for a show that's been running over 40 years. That's natural. One thing I will complain about though is the ending, being kinda dumb. Like, Emily, honey, we know you're strong enough to push 3 goddamn garbage trucks out of the way. I think the My Story library book did it better, having more trucks in the way. Ironically, the era of the show Whiff was introduced in was the least they did with him, and overall the smallest amount of appearances he got. Outside of Emily's rubbish, Whiff played a small role in the season 12 episode Toby's Special Surprise, and one background cameo in The Great Discovery, so there's not really much to discuss here. What I will say though, judging by the mini role in Toby's Special Surprise, is what I think Whiff's very small usage of that episode is definitely a subtle hint on how they wanted to go with the character. They could have chosen any character, and Thomas is usually one that Sir Tom Hat arrives on to go inspect on stuff, or Edward, but they chose Whiff. And from what I remember from the Nitrogen era, he had that a couple times as well, where he is paired with Sir Topham Hatt, and he is used as this inspection type character. A Winston type of character, you can say. It's not much character-wise on how he was portrayed there, since it is a Toby-centric episode, but it's somewhat an idea on what they probably want to go with the character later on. I think CGI choosing to bring back Whiff in its second season definitely shows how much they want to prioritize Whiff in many ways. One, considering bringing him into the Nitrogen era in general out of characters that had been in the series long before he was, because Whiff was one of the last new characters introduced into the model series. And he only had 2 episodes really, one to himself. I think the fact that they prioritized him and gave him a whole location on top of that, just to have in more stories, I feel like that really shows they wanted to expand upon him. It's almost like Emily effect. It's not really passing of the torch per se, but there is sort of a mirroring in a way where Emily and Whiff share an episode in Whiff's introduction and introduces him into the series, and in the next transition era they try to bring Whiff into more prominent roles, similar to Emily from season 7 to 8 and so on. Just the fact they gave him his own presence and what they did for him in season 14 to 16, and in Misty Island in general having him mature, it's very much of a departure of a little bit we saw of him in season 11 as this oblivious, geeky, back of the class type of character. And now he's more of the Edward type persona, even sharing the same voice in the US dub. I think that is very appreciative that they wanted to give him more, and they sort of gave him all the pieces and exposure as well with the whole special, a whole location, and a new character to balance off from as well. They definitely wanted for a less stereotypical approach of a nerdy and geeky type of character. Whiff's inclusion in Misty Island Rescue feels almost surreal in retrospective, but he also kinda saved the movie for me in some ways. Like, despite how nonsensical the circumstances were, my favorite scene was near the end where after locating Thomas and the logging locos, Whiff instantly becomes more authoritative by straightening his glasses, from wiggling his nose and demanding for the others to listen to him. The following scene that featured Whiff leading the charge back to Sodor through the tunnel was also a highlight of the movie for me. His role in the movie Misty Island Rescue was really intriguing, to say the least. I've never realized how few engines we had on Sodor who were familiar with its geography and had ventured there to call back to. Given that he is frequently seen gathering rubbish trucks throughout the island, it would make some sort of sense of his character to be familiar with Sodor's geography. Maybe he asked about what was beyond the tunnel as he gathered waste during the building of the Sodor Search and Rescue Center. And I will agree though, this is a little absurd considering how the narrative emphasizes how that Whiff somehow has extensive knowledge about both Misty Island and the Misty Island Tunnel. However, Salty was the one who first presented the idea of a neighboring island across the sea, so it stands to reason that he should have been aware of the tunnel as well. I can look past it though. It's literally a Nichiren era writing, so they had to bring these two characters back into the special somehow, right? I believe that establishing him as a character that works at the dump was a clever idea to keep him around. Considering how much of a leader he is with the other engines as seen with Misty Island, he would be able to manage a waste dump with ease. It worked as a strategy to provide Whiff, who in the end had no true geographical location within the show, a place of his own. It's a common marketing tactic they use with the other characters such as Rocky and Harold with the introduction of the Sodor Search and Rescue Center, and would further do with the Skarloey Railway engines and the Blue Mountain Quarry, and so on. As I've said earlier, Whiff's appearance in the Hit era is ironically short, so I'm glad CGI, specifically the Nitrogen era, was able to flesh him out a bit more, giving him his own location and his own helper that he could bounce off with, that being Scruff. Scruff was a great way to expand that world building of Sodor and shed light on a location that would make sense. Whiff and Scruff make a great team because they complement one another and work well together to sort waste, a task that other engines would likely cringe at. It also gives the rubbish dump more personality, since I don't think Whiff would be able to operate there by himself. Whiff distinguished himself even after Scruff received a fresh coat of paint by assuming responsibility and showing concern for the preservation of his paint job. He even suggested that doing jobs that would be less dirty to give him purpose at the waste dump in Scruff's makeover. Although a lot of fans, from what I can tell, have no real opinion on Scruff, I think we can all appreciate the fact that the writers cared enough to introduce an entirely new character that would serve as a work partner for Whiff. Similar how Salty has Porter or how the China Clay twins have Marion. While Whiff had roles in several different episodes in the Nitrogen era, one episode in particular where Whiff's character shines through is Whiff's Wish from season 16. Whiff's Wish is undoubtedly a far cry from Emily's Rubbish and Misty Island's portrayal of him. To be honest, I think this could be my least favorite Whiff episode because of how his goals and actions go against that has been said about him up to this point. Like, are you really telling me that Whiff, who didn't even bat an eye when Spencer intentionally made fun of him in the first episodes, is now really conscious about his position when Spencer makes fun of him again, to the extent that he consciously decides not to complete his own work? Kind of contradicts how he has been depicted, where he didn't care what others thought of him. It's not that serious, and I'm glad that the writers during Nitrogen wanted to give him his own very spotlight episode, but it's still a bit jarring to say the least. It's a little bit admirable that he so ardently wants to be taken a bit more seriously in the CGI series. He's very charming. The Hit era kind of felt like they wanted him to be more of an oblivious character, which also had its charm, but I like that CGI shows that he wants to be taken a little bit more seriously. It shows that he really wants to be respected. Some elements of Whiff's Wish I still kinda like though, as I feel like the writer's main inspiration for this episode was the history of Whiff's basis. Whiff takes comfort in Maiten's work since he never needs to question his value because he is confident in his abilities. Additionally, he enjoys doing garbage job in particular since it frees him from having to live up to any genuine expectation and allows him to work diligently and happily. However, he secretly wishes he might still be recognized as seen as magnificent and refined as he once was. Whiff's occupation in the series is actually ironic when you consider how elegant and clean his basis is, and how his basis was known to be a tidy private engine. With how Whiff had to take over for most of his friends' jobs, he was rather determined and shows leadership in tasks given to him. I found it interesting that he was challenged by his job in this episode since he did question his importance, but after understanding that role of Sodor's waste dump engine is just as important as it's pulling important figures across the island, his character really comes through in this instance, in my opinion, and he knows how to comfort himself when issues arise and return his attention to work at hand. Overall, I think it's a very nice story for Whiff in the CGI series. I like how they took advantage of Whiff's basis being sort of a grand engine to parallel with Spencer, being known as the private engine, and poetically show that Whiff has some desire to be admired. After Nitrogen, characters like Whiff, Rosie, and even Mavis halfway through, characters that were used a lot as secondary characters in the Nitrogen era, faded back in the Brenner era, which was fine. Brenner wanted to focus on pre-establishing the main cast for this new era, along with bringing in some old fan favorites and some completely new characters. Something I have noticed was they did push Whiff's appearances in season 20 a tad bit more than usual. Like, no, he wasn't the main, but he didn't need it to be. He served as a role on making Sodor feel more populated and was just vibing, and I think roles like that suit him well. I think it's funny to say the least that Whiff and even Scruff wouldn't have appeared in the Big World Big Adventures era at all if it weren't for the episode The Case of the Puzzling Parts, because as confirmed by Thomas Theorist, it was meant to be a season 21 episode, which would have meant if it were released in its intended season, Whiff and Scruff would have fell off the face of the earth to never be seen again. Or so you think. Surprise, surprise, Whiff was one of the first characters considered to bring back to the Thomas reboot, surprisingly enough. It was barely used in Boba, or even the era before that, but I guess the new writing team saw great potential in him. And hey, I'm not complaining. It's interesting to note Whiff being brought back was prioritized before characters like Toby, Edward, and Henry. Whiff is without a doubt my favorite All Engines Go character. I believe it's Gordon, then Bruno, and him. It's surprisingly nice to see him portrayal as an inventive inventor who stands in for the younger kids as a parental figure. The moment where he drops point-sized bits of wisdom to the other engines, specifically to Thomas and Percy in episodes like As Good as New and Thomas for a Day, were so endearing. It's honestly a crime that it took an entire season for him to be introduced. Yet, the waste dump has been a staple location since the very beginning of AEG. I get that there were financial difficulties to introduce him in the first season, but they really missed out because some of my favorite episodes from the reboot involve him. Definitely a cute little reintroduction and more simplistic and modern edge that AEG has. You can definitely see the whole mad scientist approach with Whiff. It still fits since the glasses carry him. The glasses can portray so many things in a character in media. I think Whiff in All Engines Go is great. He feels like a more fleshed out and intriguing character, and the stories they've utilized him have just made him more intriguing. His feelings has changed from being that of a character with a marketable gimmick to sell toys to that of a proper character. I'll say that too, that the use of the scientist angle is also a great way of incorporating the change from the waste dump to the recycling plant. It makes a lot of sense to have many of the main storylines involve inventions or projects that involved reduction, recycling, and reuse. While Whiff was still neat before AEG, but it says something when the idea of running a dump wasn't considered until CGI, and even then not even decently used story-wise during the Brenner era. Similar to many of the newbies in the hit era, with a cool design and potential but not fully utilized because of the nature of the show at the time. His more fun uncle and fatherly-like attitude towards the children characters in AEG is very wholesome, and I think it is especially demonstrated in the episode Thomas for a Day. Despite how ridiculous it can be, it's one of the better illustrations of All Engines Go manages to pull off some quite decent character development, including Percy's timid and self-assured demeanor. Whiff could have remained a simple, eccentric scientist, but by developing additional layers, such as his intelligence, it gives the character greater depth and advances the plot's theme. When he realizes that Thomas is actually Percy, he just chuckles and continues acting like he's fooled until Percy acknowledges it and then highlights how brave he is and how it's acceptable to be afraid even though he still feels fear. It is a great message about self-identity, and it's presented very well, in which they use Whiff in this case, very specifically to his role, being the only engine on Sodor to have glasses. Pairing him up with Percy pretending to be Thomas, knowing that Whiff could be oblivious to the idea, works perfectly. Definitely one of my favorite episodes from the reboot. Furthermore, Whiff's wisdom makes sense because according to the timeline, he has actually been on Sodor for a considerable amount of time. The only other thing I can say is that Whiff is incredibly well played by his voice actor, Joe, which I think really enhances the character.
Well, that experiment didn't work. Oh, hello, everyone. Uh-oh, serious faces. Is everything all right?
By far, my favorite voice for the character in all layers of Thomas. Not only does he do good deliveries as the character, he's able to sing and hit high notes pretty well. Whiff's appearances in the show actually add to the character, like how he's grown attached to his pet chicken, which again is very cute. One complaint I do have about All Engines Go Whiff is, I think one aspect that everyone can agree with is his design. It isn't the best accurate representation to the original with. Incorrect color wheels that oddly don't clash well, weird addition of a gold dome, ghastly small windows, and his lining on the boiler feel oddly incomplete and overall just make him look naked. I think that AG is known to have its own stylized and different takes on character look-wise, but it really does come across as inconsistent when some of the Season 2 characters like Toby, Salty, and Beresford are one-to-one. But that's just a minor gripe and doesn't really take away the fact that he is still one of my all-time favorite characters from the reboot. Seriously, 70% of the reason why I catch up with the reboot is because of him, which speaks for itself on how well the character is handled from this era of the show. I've always found Whiff to be a very admirable character, willing to do what other engines would deem as the most undignified jobs and all. Subtext is also added by Whiff's background, particularly in a few instances where he expresses the desire to be grand like others in CGI, or just be a good moral support for the other younger characters like in AG. I hope my analysis on Whiff have made you appreciate him more from once being considered a nothing cash grab character to someone that actually has some depth and history in the show. So the fact that the multiple teams from the show have utilized and showed the character archetype, Whiff's 3 eras are very interesting and they all fit in their own different way. It just in the end showcases how versatile the character is and how much you can get off from someone like Whiff. And the production team probably saw that and they realized that, and that's why they wanted to push him and prioritize him within all these very, very different eras. No matter how much the show has changed, he's definitely a character that has remained prominent in the show's runners' lives. I think that says something.